The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that I don't think I will ever play again. But let me explain why. The Last of Us Part 2 is undoubtedly one of the greatest video games ever created, so why will I never play it again? Upon reflection, I think it is fair to say, the fact that I do not want to relive the experiences of this narrative is a testament to the outcome that this game so desperately desired its player to feel. But to some, this outcome, that was so expertly crafted by everyone at Naughty Dog, is the precise reason why they despise this sequel so much, regardless of whether the outcome was the intention or not. But why do so many people feel like this? How can a narrative exist that is subjectively awful whilst being objectively as close to perfection as video games have ever gotten in telling a story akin to that of a novel? To understand the thoughts of the audience, it is essential to try and break down what this game was trying to achieve, and more importantly, why. In doing this, we will be able to see why this game is not just an amazing narrative, but also how this game causes us to reflect on parts of ourselves that so many of us are not ready to see, and why artistic leaps in storytelling such as this one are imperative to pushing forward the medium of video games as we know them, and changing the way in which we experience experiences. Spoilers ahead. But before we can talk about this game, we first need to look at its predecessor, The Last of Us. We are doing this to try and understand the world, the narrative taking place within that, and the subsequent effect that it had on the player. Also, from this we are going to be able to grasp a basic knowledge of the themes and tonalities of the experience, and the subsequent expectations that were created from that for the sequel. The opening of this title is arguably one of the best introductions of any video game ever created, in terms of setting the scene for the journey and the emotional turmoils that are about to come. We view the opening from the eyes of the protagonist's daughter, experiencing the slow build-up of confusion from within our home as the world begins to crumble on the outside. Even though all of this is going on around us, the focus of this prologue is mainly on the family unit. This is a thematic element that stays as the focal point throughout the duration of the narrative: personal connection. What allowed this story to stand out in a sea of post-apocalyptic tales is its focus on the people within the world rather than the world itself. Placing the focus on a simple yet complex human emotion, in this case being love, allowed the narrative to thrive, with the setting of the world around our cast of characters pushing the narrative forward by being able to create a unique series of circumstances that called into action the simple question from the audience: what would I do in this situation? Thus, creating an investment in the story.
sir. There's a little girl. But... Yes, sir.
Listen, buddy, we've just been through hell. Okay, we just need... Oh, shit. Please don't. Oh, no. Sarah. Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. God. Listen to me. I know this hurts, baby. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby. I know it hurts. Come on, baby. Please. I know, baby. I know. Sarah. Baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Come on. No. No. No, no, please.
With Joel being unable to protect his daughter, his Sarah, this sets the tone from which we enter the game. A father who has lost his daughter, a man who has lost his world. Throughout the game, we hear snippets of stories about Joel's past leading up to the moment from which we catch up with him 20 years after the prologue, indicating to us that he was a man who had lost all remorse and morals in a world gone mad, doing whatever was necessary to survive, even though survival did not matter as much to him as it once did. Shortly into the game, we are introduced to Ellie, a 14-year-old girl who Joel is tasked to escort out of the safe zone to a meet point organised by the Fireflies, who are a resistance group that is being slaughtered by whatever is left of military organisations in the area. On the way to said meet point, Joel and his accompanying friend Tessa figure out why this girl is so important to the Fireflies. It is because she cannot be infected by the fungus that caused this apocalyptic world. The Fireflies believe that she may be the cure, so are bringing her to a reclaimed lab to be further studied. However, once things go south at the meet point and Tessa is killed, it is up to Joel to escort Ellie across the country in the name of humanity's salvation. And thus begins the central journey of this narrative. Throughout the bulk of the story, we see that Joel is trying to remain distant from Ellie, most likely because her aid reminds him of his own daughter who he had lost long ago, and getting too close to her may make him feel more human again, a trait which he believes is not valuable in order to survive. However, over time, we begin to see his guard come down, as both he and Ellie begin to bond and move past certain traumas in order to be able to value each other's presence in their lives.
It's me. Look. It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay.
No.
It's okay.
As we reach the end of their journey across the country to humanity's salvation, a journey which saw them both survive near-death experiences and see things that will have changed them forever. The pair now have a bond akin to that of a family. Both of our central characters managed to find something that they had lost to this cruel world, and with Ellie's arrival to her destination, humanity itself had found something that it had long since forgotten: hope. However, as it would soon turn out to be, one of these things was about to be lost.
It's got its ups and downs, but you can't deny the view, though.
Once Ellie and Joel are brought to the lab after being found in the streets and knocked out, it has been made clear to Joel that in order for the doctors to get what they need from Ellie to make a vaccine, she has to die. This understandably leaves Joel distraught. Having lost one daughter already, he feels like he's losing everything all over again. Not only was the protection of Ellie something for Joel to live for in the literal sense, in that the fate of humanity depended on him taking her to where she is needed, but also in a metaphorical sense, in that he has found someone who he can protect again, similarly to his daughter Sarah, and he can now complete the task that he originally failed to do. This is the mindset that drives him to do what he does next, protecting someone he loves. Joel refuses to accept what is happening and sets about wiping out the remainder of the Fireflies at the facility and rescuing an unconscious Ellie who is being prepped for surgery. With Joel taking the life of the surgeon, he is not only killing an innocent man, a man doing whatever is necessary to save humanity, he is also killing humanity's last hope. Once Ellie comes round and asks what happened, he simply lies to her and tells her that there are plenty more like her and that there is no cure. In the very last scene of the game, Ellie asks Joel whether or not he is telling the truth, showing us that she is suspicious of how he is acting. Joel swears this is the truth, and we end the game on a shot and a topic of conversation that will forever be discussed throughout gaming history, as we are left with Ellie simply saying,
Okay.
with just the right tone to argue she is either doubtful, trustful, or acceptful of the fact that she may not want to know the truth. It is possible to argue that Ellie knew herself from the very beginning that she was supposed to die, and that her journey across the country was in itself a farewell tour of a world she never really knew. But it is also arguable that Ellie never knew that this would be her fate, and that she would be either happy to give her life or thankful that Joel saved her from an unwanted fate. This whole last section of the game brings in a question of morality and humanity that no person will ever be able to fully agree on. It asks a simple question that is one that was also posed at the beginning of the game. What would you do in this situation? Is Joel a bad person for damning humanity to protect someone he loved, or is he justified in what he was doing? To give you my thoughts on it, of course Joel is wrong for doing what he does, from an objective standpoint at least. However, in Joel doing what he did on the subjective basis of love, is he not doing the most human thing of all, regardless of whether or not it destroys mankind's future? It could be argued that if humanity as a whole is willing to kill a young girl in order to preserve its existence, does then the idea of being human lose some of its meaning? If we are simply playing a game of numbers and trying to consider the overall good without taking into account the good of humanity on a more personal level, then what are we really other than just another animal trying to preserve its existence? The very ability to make a conscious thought to protect the love you have for someone over the greater good is, in my opinion, the most human thing of all.
I was supposed to take her to the Fireflies and walk away. You go halfway across the country with someone, and then we made it. You found the Firefly. Because of her, they were actually going to make a cure. The only catch, it would kill her. Sweet Jesus.
Doctor?
What are you doing? I won't let you take her. This is our future. Think of all the lives we'll save.
Jesus Christ, Joel. What do you do?
I saved her. Come on, baby girl. I got you. I got you.
Cover the exit. Don't let him get away.
Shit.
It doesn't take long playing The Last of Us Part 2 to understand that we are in for a darker experience. The Last of Us as a whole is a series that most people will associate with loss, as in the first game, Joel is trying to cope with the loss of his daughter, and in the second, Ellie is trying to cope with the loss of the only person who would do anything to keep her safe. However, as I mentioned earlier, I believe this series as a whole deals more with the concept of love rather than loss. The first game focused more on Joel's journey in rediscovering love after having lost it long ago, whereas the second game takes a darker route of focusing on Ellie losing everything and dealing with the emotional grief that comes afterwards. In fact, it could be argued that Ellie is not dealing with her emotional grief at all in this game. Rather, she is using revenge as an escape from the reality of having to move on after a sudden loss, as she knows that it may be too tough for her to process. Given her attitude towards life in general throughout the last 2 years that we have not been with her, that we discover through flashback sequences throughout the game, it becomes clear to us that Ellie may know more about what really happened at the Fireflies laboratory than what we may have been initially led to believe. This knowledge and curiosity, mixed with what could only be described as a form of teenage angst, ultimately leads Ellie down a path that she would regret taking, and then further beyond that. Ellie's mental health will be an important point to consider as we come to the end of this video and finally answer the question of why I will never play this game again. But for now, it is essential to understand the journey that the narrative takes us on from beginning to end, and more importantly, why this narrative exists in the first place and the potential disservice that it may have done to our protagonists. While this video, for the most part, is trying to remain largely unbiased in terms of simply exploring the game in depth, we are also going to be touching on some narrative criticisms throughout, as the choice of story that the writers went for in this game was far harder to execute, and while the efforts made were valiant and contributed to one of the most interesting video games ever made, it was not done perfectly. Grieving, vengeance, these are terms that we will associate with most events that take place throughout this game, whether it be circumstances that cause these reactions or the fallout because of them. It is fair to say that when people first picked up their controllers to play this game, they had a fair idea of what was coming, but no one could have predicted the manner in which it was done and how the narrative dealt with it moving forward. And what I am referring to, of course, is the death of Joel.
Joel, get up. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't do this. Joel, please get up. No. Fucking kill you.
The manner of the build-up to Joel's death was a purposely short one that left a bitter taste in the mouths of many players. His death felt sudden, and it also felt like there was a number of unresolved issues and story arcs he still had to go on. While people may call this poor writing, I actually believe that this was the complete intention of the writers and is actually more accurate to real life than we care to admit, which is why it may have struck a nerve with some players. When we typically lose a character in any form of media, we usually see their story arc resolved, obstacles overcome, or generally just story beats that feel like they are coming to an end. This is because writers usually write characters as they would write books, with a beginning, middle, and end, with then a plot centered around that. Therefore, a character usually ends up following similar arcs to the point where an audience can guess that either their time is up or the narrative that they are a part of is coming to an end. In real life, when we lose someone, it's never quite as simple as that. If you lose a friend, you may still have something that you wanted to say to them, a movie that you were supposed to go see together. If you lose your mum or dad, maybe they were supposed to come over to your place someday and tell you about a book they read, or something funny that happened to them the other day, back when everything was still okay. In real life, there are no concrete endings, and bringing that back to the game, it felt like there were still things for Joel to do, a feeling that grows more and more as you play through the game, to the point where by the end, you feel like Joel had in fact started the beginning of what could have been one of the most happy and meaningful journeys of his life. Not only is Joel's life cut short in a rather horrific fashion, it is even more traumatic when you consider that Ellie had to watch this unfold, unable to save him, as he saved her years ago. I mentioned earlier that while this game is about grief, the majority of Ellie's story could be argued to be centered around the denial of the grieving process, favouring revenge. One of the main criticisms levied at this game was that Joel's death felt rather underwhelming in terms of the overall effect it had on the characters, and that it was used to push the particular story that the writers had in mind, rather than the stories that best suited these characters. Now, while there is an argument to be made for that, I also think it's very important to remember that this game is not trying to immerse you in asking questions of what would you do like the first game. Rather, it is simply presenting you a story and taking you along on that character's journey. While you may control the game, You are not controlling the thoughts of the character. You are not controlling Ellie, merely watching how her story unfolds through her own actions that you initiate when you pick up that controller. So, to go back to the point, when people take issue with the fact that they didn't get much of a grieving process for a character who by this point was one of the most beloved video game characters of all time, it is important to remember that this game is simply trying to take you on a journey, at this point at least, from Ellie's point of view. And at this point in the narrative, she is not grieving. She is putting that aside in order to focus on avenging the death of someone important to her. Her vengeance takes her to Seattle, under the guise of trying to go after Joel's brother Tommy, who was even more blinded by the idea of revenge and had not processed Joel's death at all, rather let it consume him. Ellie, her love interest Dina, and Tommy are all after the people who were there when Joel was murdered and were responsible for his death, but they all have their eyes on one person in particular, the one who orchestrated it all: Abby. Abby as a whole is a character that could even be argued to have more of an arc throughout the course of this game in comparison to Ellie. While Ellie's story very much revolves around the beginnings of seeking revenge, we are introduced to Abby towards the end of her course of vengeance, and then pick back up with her later on, following her as she is facing the consequences of the lust for revenge that she was compelled to act upon. Her character marks a rather important statement throughout the game as a whole, and both acts in equal part as embodying all the issues of the game and the message of the game, the latter being overlooked by many players due to the blind rage that they felt towards her for being the one who killed Joel. In order to understand Abby's story in more detail, we first need to understand the larger picture of what her story represents and move past what many players chose to ignore in their blind allegiance to Ellie. The stories of both Ellie and Abby are two different halves of the cycle of revenge. The cycle of revenge would be considered to be the overarching plot within the narrative taking place. In order to break down the cycle of revenge into a simple explanation for the sake of this video, we will say that the cycle has four main parts. The first part is the action that causes someone to want to seek revenge, in this case Abby murdering Joel. The second part is the beginning of a person seeking revenge on another, in this case Ellie's quest to murder Abby and everyone involved. The third part is the successful completion of that revenge, for example if Ellie managed to successfully murder Abby. And finally, part 4, dealing with the consequences of that vengeance that was sought, which is what Abby deals with in the bulk of her narrative throughout the game. What is interesting about that cycle is that part 1 and part 3 are linked in the cycle of revenge, in that usually the successful enacting of vengeance on someone is usually the trigger that causes someone to want revenge on the person who enacted that vengeance previously. This also makes parts 2 and 4 interlinked, as usually when someone is seeking revenge on someone else, the other person is facing the consequences for their actions. It is important that we understand how this works, as the cycle of revenge will be mentioned again towards the end of this video, as we will see plenty of examples of how the dual plot lines going on throughout the course of the game link with the connections that we have just established in the revenge cycle. We are left largely in the dark about Abby's story until after we are finished playing through the majority of Ellie's part within the game, where you're only with her briefly as her and her team search for Joel in order to murder him, and it remains unclear as to why until later on. Therefore, for the sake of this video, we will be focusing primarily on Ellie and her perspective, but we will shift over to Abby's later on. Both of these stories, while having flashbacks, primarily take place within the same period of 3 days in Seattle, with us first on the 3-day journey with Ellie, and then subsequently with Abby. The bulk of those 3 days with Ellie as she goes through Seattle, killing off Abby's accomplices one by one, is largely standard in its format. Ellie, along with Dina, wastes no time in making her way deep into the heart of the city, searching for ways to get from one area to the next, retracing the steps that Abby made with her crew, while also following the carnage that Tommy had left behind him, as he has had at least a day's head start. We see Ellie recognise the damage that Tommy is causing as she remembered some of the techniques of combat and torture that Joel had talked about when discussing his darker years earlier after the apocalypse when he used to run with his brother. This becomes more important as the game carries on, as we begin to see Ellie's more ruthless and hot-headed side be complemented by the things she's picked up off Joel over the years, allowing her to turn her pent-up aggression into straight-up murder, under the guise that it is for the greater good, as she is searching for both Tommy and vengeance in killing Abby. During our 3 days in Seattle with Ellie, we get gaps filled in for us in regards to what happened with her and Joel during the time we were not with them, through flashback/dream sequences. One of the first ones that we encounter is reminiscent of the atmosphere created in the initial game, and is arguably one of the sweetest moments in the entire franchise.
Happy birthday, kiddo.
What is this?
This is a thing that took a mighty effort to find. Take it. Close your eyes. It'll be worth it.
Okay.
Seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
I do okay.
Are you fucking kidding me?
You're welcome, kiddo.
This flashback sequence ends with a slight nudge to the audience, showing us that Ellie is still thinking about what happened with the Fireflies and that she has not moved on, a trait that you could argue to be a parallel of what we are seeing with present-day Ellie. Our second flashback shows us that as Ellie is getting older, she is really beginning to press on Joel about what actually happened with the Fireflies, and she is sure that he is lying to her about something. What once was a blossoming father-daughter-esque relationship has now turned into one of tension that was about to break. In the third flashback, we see Ellie finally return to the Fireflies laboratory and discover the truth about what happened. When Joel finds her, she gets him to admit what he did, and in that moment, their entire relationship was all but destroyed. They continued to live side by side, but it has been heavily suggested at this point that Ellie did not speak much with Joel after this, and that they never fully mended what they had. Which is what could be weighing on Ellie even more, the fact that she spent so much time angry with him, when at the core of it all, she understood why he did what he did. This idea of regret over being angry rather than cherishing the ones that we love is an idea that we in our own lives should take into consideration. and acts as one of the most important points in the entire game, both in the flashbacks and in the present story. We quickly realise as Ellie ventures further into Seattle that they have stumbled into a conflict between two factions: the military group, which Abby and her crew were a part of, the Washington Liberation Front, also referred to as the WLF, and religious extremists known as the Seraphites, commonly referred to by the WLF as Scars. However, this conflict matters little to Ellie, as she is prepared to kill anyone who stands in her way in order to achieve her goal. The introduction of these factions and Seattle as a whole can be seen as both the best and worst parts of The Last of Us Part 2. I mentioned earlier how the beauty from these games lies in the personal stories told within a detailed world, rather than simply the magnitude of the world itself. The story that is taking place within Seattle in terms of the factions at war once again exemplifies how a detailed world such as this one can be so important to aiding a story, but should not become the highlight of the game itself. It can be argued that the story taking place with the factions almost takes too much of a center stage at certain points in the game through Abby's story. Now, Abby was more involved with what was going on within the factions, but even the amount of time that we spend with Abby and the arguable better writing that takes place with her character throughout the game goes directly against what I believed should be the core of the Last of Us universe: the stories of Ellie and Joel. This is an argument we may go into more detail on in the end of the video. However, I felt it was important to bring it up here, as it is at this point in the game that we begin to see these elements crop up, which all play a part in what divided fans of the series so strongly upon the release of this title. Throughout the days in Seattle, we see Ellie grapple with her moralities and priorities. She begins to show less and less remorse as the need for revenge consumes her, leading her to effectively torture one of Abby's accomplices in order to find out where she is. Her slow but sure mental breakdown is accompanied by the fact that Dina has begun to fall ill, and it is later discovered that she is pregnant with the child of her former boyfriend Jesse, who actually shows up later in Seattle as he reveals he went after Dina and Ellie in order to give them some backup. It is Jesse that looks after Dina for the most part, as Ellie continues her quest to find Tommy and take care of Joel's murderers. However, it is eventually decided that Dina is too ill to stay in Seattle. The choice is then made to leave Seattle with over half the people involved in Joel's death killed. However, they decide to stay one more day to try and find Tommy and bring him home. It is at this point in the game that we really see Ellie begin to wrestle internally with whether or not she should continue her quest, and maybe even begin to question why she is doing it to begin with, as this is not what Joel would have wanted. During this section of the game, Jesse and Ellie go off together in search of Tommy. However, they decide to split up to look in different places. When Ellie gets to where she is going, she finds two more people who were there the night Joel was killed, and one of them was very close, in particular, with Abby. We see Ellie at this point try to extort information out of them using a trick that Joel had talked about before. However, this backfires as Ellie does not take all the necessary precautions, and she is forced to kill them both. When Ellie finds out that one of them is pregnant, she is sickened and falls to the floor, unable to comprehend what she has just done. It is in this moment that it is arguable that both Ellie and the audience realise that she has lost a part of herself that she will never be able to get back. She is interrupted in this moment by Tommy, who was found by Jesse, and they both manage to make it back to Dina. At this point, they are finally preparing to go home. With Tommy being able to kill one of Abby's companions, she was now the only one that remained from the group that came to kill Joel, and everyone was happy to leave it there, Ellie included. But unfortunately, Abby, consumed by rage and a new lust for revenge, finds out where they were hiding and quickly takes Tommy hostage and kills Jesse, leaving Dina's baby without a father. Here, we are left on a cliffhanger, and the game takes us to a flashback, but this time, it is a flashback of Abby, and our journey with her picks up from here. We learn rather quickly why Abby had such a hatred for Joel and was so hell-bent on making sure that she killed him. In this flashback scene, we find out that Abby is the daughter of the surgeon that Joel killed in order to rescue Ellie. This is where we see the first parallel in the cycle of revenge between Abby and Ellie, in that what motivated Ellie to come after Abby is the same motivation that drove Abby to come after Joel in the first place.
Joel, get up. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't shoot. Joel, please get up. No! No!
Burn in hell, pendejo.
I'll fucking kill you.
Whoa, what are you doing? Manny.
Cleaning up.
No. We're here for him. That's it.
It's too risky to leave them alive.
Too fucking bad.
He's right. We can't have loose ends.
We killed them. We're no better than he was. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, look at my face.
Fuck your face. You should have been guarding the upstairs like I told you to. Move! Back up.
Calm down.
Or what? Back the fuck up!
Calm down!
Garden! You gonna shoot me?
Stop!
We're done.
After this flashback, we are brought back to day 1 in Seattle. However, this time it is with Abby, and we follow her journey over the 3 days as she goes through her own personal battles, and through this, we learn more about the setting within Seattle and are given some context to things that we were shown when we were going through the city as Ellie. It is clear that over the years that Abby has been looking for Joel, that she has been highly motivated by this revenge as she has become incredibly strong. This idea of eventually finding and killing Joel has been on her mind for years after her father's death, as we see in various flashback sequences throughout her 3 days, similarly to what we saw with Ellie. We are given more context in regards to the latter stages of the cycle of revenge, and see how this cycle not only makes you lose everyone around you, but also lose yourself. Abby wasted opportunities at relationships that she had always wanted, and had to watch as all of her friends were dying around her, all because of her obsession with murdering Joel. She finds herself more and more throughout the 3 days at the mercy of the consequences of her lust for revenge. While the war between the two factions in Seattle becomes way more prevalent throughout this part of the game, I am not going to delve too deep into it for the sake of this video, as the primary focus of what I want to talk about within this world is the story of Joel and Ellie. I feel like that this is a good place to begin to talk about what makes both of these games, in particularly the first one, so good and engaging in a more overall sense. We may retouch on this in the end, but the reason why these stories are so good is because even though we have an amazingly well crafted and well thought out world in the franchise, so full of intricate details and interesting ideas, its focus primarily is on the personal journeys of Joel and Ellie. This series, if continued correctly, should live and die with these two characters. Now, it is arguable in other franchises just as good, such as Uncharted for example, it would make sense that the main characters pass the baton onto a new group of characters for a new generation of players to enjoy. However, the journey of The Last of Us became such a perfect story with Joel and Ellie at the heart of it all that it simply has to be about them and about them only. Even if the developers had always planned on turning The Last of Us into a big universe full of different stories, I believe that the true quality of everything as a whole is due to the specific combination of those characters and their story in this world. In bringing this back to what I was saying, I will not be going into depth on the factions themselves, rather only the interactions Abby has with them and her subsequent adoption, if you will, of Lev from the Scars and how their relationship draws parallels to that of Joel and Ellie. Throughout the 3 days in Seattle, it is made increasingly apparent to us that Abby and her close group of friends do not really value either side in the war between the factions. They themselves were former members of the Fireflies and are now simply bouncing from place to place, doing whatever it takes to fit in. We also catch glimpses of other characters that Ellie would soon murder, showing off their more human side, to further force the idea that Ellie has been murdering people rather than just killing NPCs as you normally see in games. Some of these people would die for the cause, some couldn't care less. Regardless, Ellie did not hesitate to wipe any of them out in order to get what she wanted, and would eventually have to pay the price for these deaths, as with each one she lost a little more of herself. To summarise the 3 days that we are with Abby, it is essentially her trying to find Owen on day 1, her friend and love interest with whom she previously shared a relationship with and was also there the night she killed Joel. Owen has run off because he has had enough of the war between the two factions and is debating to himself whether or not he's even on the good side. While Owen is now with someone else, it is clear that these two still have feelings for each other, which we are made very aware of once she finds him at their secret location at the end of the first day. On the way to finding him, Abby had run into 2 former scars named Yara and Lev. On the second day, Abby had a nightmare where she sees Yara and Lev both dead, as she did not go back to help them when they were in need. This is a good point to mention quickly, that it is shown to us that Abby has been suffering from almost daily nightmares, each one similar to the last, where she is simply replaying herself walking down the corridor of the Fireflies hospital into the room where she sees her dad dead on the floor. These nightmares further solidify the idea that Abby had been consumed by the need for revenge, and the fact that her nightmares continued even after finally getting what she wanted shows that revenge isn't always the definite conclusion that we want it to be. Back to day 2. After this nightmare, Abby feels compelled to go save Yara and Lev. When she finds them and takes them back to where her and Owen are holding up, they find out that Yara's wounds are too great to heal on their own, and that she would need to have her arm amputated. It is up to Abby and her younger sibling Lev, who is strongly alluded to being trans in this story, so to avoid accidental misgenderings on my part while writing this, I will refer to them as they/them. It is up to them to make their way through the city to the same hospital that we were in with Ellie on day 2. Abby and Lev eventually make it to the hospital before Ellie does, and Abby goes on her own to find medicine as Lev will be shot on sight by the WLF. Here, she runs into one of her friends who Ellie would subsequently torture and kill only a few hours later, and she tells her that the medicine she is looking for may be at the basement level, which was ground zero for the outbreak in Seattle. Abby ventures down there and has to face off against all kinds of horror in a place that almost no one would survive on their own. Luckily, she makes it back out with the supplies she needs, and both her and Lev make their way back to Yara and get her treated. This day largely does not offer us anything in particular in regards to the overall plotline. Rather, it acts as a way to try and solidify our bonds with these new characters by taking us on a fun to play and interesting adventure, all the while learning more about Abby and having her character more fleshed out as a 3-dimensional person. The game from this point is trying to make you sympathize with and grow to like Abby in order for you to become more conflicted with the mentality that Ellie has been acting upon, and tries to push the narrative that the quote bad guy in this game is entirely dependent upon which point of view you are observing from. While this is a great message to push, I think the writers underestimated the level of devotion that people would have to Ellie and Joel, and therefore many people struggle to bond with Abby on a level that will be important come the end of the game. Even when I played the game for the first time, I rushed through the majority of Abby's gameplay hoping to get back to Ellie. While the game done a great job of developing Abby, I do not think the effect that was sought after was achieved by the writers, at least in terms of the wider gaming audience. After this, we move on to day 3, where Lev has run off back to the Scars Island in order to find their mother. Yara and Abby chase after them by taking a boat out to the island. Shortly after they reach the island, the attack that was planned by the WLF begins, and both Abby and Yara find themselves stuck in the middle of an all-out war as they try to find Lev. With both sides now willing to kill them on sight, they eventually find Lev, and in their escape from the island, Yara is killed by the WLF leader, but not before killing him herself. Once Abby and Lev make it to the boat, they sail back to the mainland with the island on fire behind them. With both sides of the war effectively decimated, This visual acts as a beautiful metaphor for how there are no real winners in war, and once again strikes a fascinating parallel with the cycle of revenge and the game's overall message, as the idea of searching for victory through vengeance leaves no real winners. Once Abby and Lev make it back to where they were originally hiding out, they find both Owen and Mel lying dead, as this was now after Ellie had found them. As the realization sinks in that Abby has lost everything, she falls to her knees and throws up, disgusted by herself and the loss of the last person who truly mattered to her. Once they realize that Ellie accidentally left a map that showed where they were hiding, Abby and Lev quickly make their way to the hideout. It is at this point that the cycle of revenge once again looks certain to repeat itself. And so we are brought back to the present day. Abby standing over an injured Tommy, about to pull the trigger of the gun she used to kill Jesse. It is in this moment that Tommy throws himself at her, giving Ellie a chance to run, but getting himself shot in the process. Here, we continue playing as Abby in one of the hardest and most conflicting parts of the game, as we hunt down Ellie through the cinema in order to finally stop her murderous rampage. This fight that takes place leaves them both rather injured. However, it is Abby that comes out victorious, beating Ellie to a bloody pulp. Dina tries to intervene, but is quickly shot with an arrow by Lev, leaving Ellie and Dina defenseless.
Stop! She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good. Abby.
It is here that we see the first instance of what the game is trying to teach us, forgiveness, and in that breaking the cycle of revenge. But to go into even more detail, it is less about forgiveness and rather about the idea of being willing to admit you can try and forgive someone, a message that will become far more apparent at the very end of the game. Abby was about to give in and get the revenge she so desperately craved, but it was the fear in Lev's eyes that made her do otherwise. Lev didn't want to see Abby as a monster, and Abby did not want Lev to see the worst of her, once again drawing parallels to the relationship that Joel and Ellie once had. It was Ellie who pulled Joel out of a dark place, and now it was Lev's turn to do the same thing with Abby. With Abby willing to let them live, they begin the journey away from Seattle, leaving both Ellie and Dina covered in their own blood, filled with regret and emptiness, as Abby both figuratively and literally proved herself to be the stronger person. We then jump forward to what seems to be at least a year after Abby left both Ellie and Dina for dead at that cinema, and we see Ellie taking care of Dina's baby in a beautiful little home overlooking the countryside. With Ellie and Dina having a place and a family of their own, it feels like they are finally living the life that they had always dreamed of.
Hey, you know what? I'm gonna teach you how to play guitar. When your hands are bigger.
However, it is clear that Abby still being alive is bugging Ellie, and we see that she is suffering from severe PTSD due to Joel's death, and how she feels like she failed him.
Come on, little dude. Come on, little guy. Do you want to eat?
home. We're home. Breathe, breathe. Okay, I'm gonna take him, okay?
It is clear that she is still very on edge, and this is not helped when Tommy comes to visit. Scarred and disfigured from his injuries in Seattle, he talks to Ellie about Abby and Lev and how he has figured out where they are. Him being no longer fit to do much, he asks Ellie to go after them. When Ellie is hesitant, Tommy berates her for betraying the memory of Joel, and he is quickly kicked out of the house by Dina. Here we are treated to what at this time in the game feels like the final flashback, where we see Ellie, Dina and Jesse all interacting with each other at a party. The party that was mentioned to have taken place right before we picked up with Ellie on the day that Joel was murdered. Here we see Dina and Ellie have a dance together, but are interrupted and called a homophobic slur. With Ellie about to confront him, Joel steps in and gets him to back off. This, however, does not go down well with Ellie, and she embarrasses him in front of everyone, saying that she does not need his help. The level of anger that she shows him here gives the audience the impression that they have not spoken to each other for at least a year or two, and that Ellie has never forgiven him. And as far as we are aware at this time, this is the last time Ellie sees Joel before he is murdered. That night, Ellie cannot sleep and decides to sneak off once again in search of Abby. She is stopped by Dina, who begs her to stay for her family. However, she does not, and this shows us that Ellie is not the person she once was, as the idea of revenge and the trauma of so much murder has corrupted what she values to the point that she is willing to lose everything, even if it means gaining nothing. It is at this point that we are once again taking control of Abby, as she and Lev make her way through Santa Barbara, looking for any fireflies that may be left. However, they are quickly captured, and we return to Ellie a number of weeks later, who has just arrived in Santa Barbara. Here, she makes short work of anyone or anything that stands in her way, as she looks to find traces of where Abby and Lev might be. She herself gets caught in a trap by the same people who captured Abby, and gets herself injured. However, this is where we see the experiences of Seattle kick in, as she manages to escape and kill the people who captured her, but not before finding out the location of where both Abby and Lev are. Ellie makes her way to the compound and sets about killing all the guards and freeing the prisoner slaves that are being held. One of these prisoners tells Ellie that Abby and Lev were taken to a beach not far from the compound. As the prisoners and the remaining guards fight in what could only be described as a bloodbath that we do not get to see, Ellie makes her way to the beach to find a horrific sight. Dozens of people hanging from wooden pillars and left to die. Among these people is Abby, who is barely alive, severely malnourished and barely able to speak. Ellie reluctantly sets her free, internally debating whether or not it was even worth killing her anymore. Abby quickly goes over to Lev, who is also tied up and unconscious. She cuts them free and they all make their way to the beach in order to sail away on boats. Just before leaving, Ellie once again begins to feel anger towards Abby, as she cannot stop picturing Joel's dead body. She then forces Abby to fight her, holding a knife to Lev's throat, indicating that she will kill Lev as well if Abby refuses this fight. Abby reluctantly agrees and they begin a fight to the death at the edge of the ocean. By this point, both Abby and Ellie are clearly broken. They are both shells of themselves, fighting for reasons that no longer even matter to them. Both have been broken by the cycle of revenge, and while Abby has chosen to break the cycle and walk away, Ellie is not quite there yet. As our two protagonists face off for the final time, Ellie suffers a severe amount of damage as she has two of her fingers bitten off. However, this doesn't stop her, as she proceeds to hold Abby's head under the water and tries to drown her and be free of this burden once and for all.
him.
Ellie's anger quickly turns into sadness during this moment as she pictures Joel looking at her from a flashback that we have not seen yet. This is enough to make Ellie let go, and she lets Abby escape with Lev, leaving her stranded, alone, and hopeless. The reason why Ellie let go will be made clear once we discuss the flashback we are about to see, but before that, we once again catch up with Ellie as she returns home. Battered, bruised and broken, she makes her way to the house to find it empty, with Dina and the baby gone. The only room with stuff still in it is Ellie's, and there she finds the guitar that Joel had left her. An underlying subplot that had been running since the beginning of the game was a song that Joel played on the guitar and subsequently taught to Ellie, which we learned through the flashbacks. Whenever Ellie would find a guitar in Seattle, she would pick it up and play a riff from the song, reminding us of the connection she had with Joel and how she wants to honour his memory. However, now with 2 missing fingers, she cannot play the guitar properly and misses notes as she tries to play Joel's song once more. This acts as a metaphor that can be taken in a few ways. I personally like to believe that it is a metaphor of the connection that she's lost with Joel after brutally seeking revenge and desecrating his memory. Not only has she lost a part of herself in the literal sense, but she's lost a part of herself internally and lost the people around her due to her obsession. All of which I believe is perfectly encapsulated in her failed playing of the guitar. She sits with the guitar and ponders the last time she saw Joel, which is the flashback I mentioned earlier, which I will show at the very end of this video, as I believe it is the perfect place to end this journey that I have taken you on. In this flashback, we get more insight into why Ellie was so angry at Joel for years. She tells Joel after the party from the flashback we saw before this one, that she believed that if she sacrificed her life in order to find a cure, then she would have had a purpose. Joel, however, remains firm in his beliefs, saying that he would do it all over again if he had to, which reaffirms to us his love for her and how he believes the world is a better place with her in it. It is in this moment that we find out why Ellie let Abby go, and why the cycle of revenge was finally able to be broken. Ellie tells Joel that she does not know if she will ever be able to forgive him, but says she's willing to try. And that is the mindset that set her free from Abby. That if she was even willing to try and forgive, then maybe she will be able to finally move on. We end on Ellie setting Joel's guitar down, an acceptance that she has to leave a part of Joel behind in order to move on, and we see her from the window leave the house and walk back out to the forest, onto an uncertain future. This last section of the game as a whole leaves Ellie's story largely open-ended. Has she accepted that she has lost everything and is going to start a new life on her own? Or has she already gone back to her hometown of Jackson to see Dina and is merely paying a visit to her old stuff before returning to her family? We will never know. Not for a long time at least. The lack of surprise from Ellie at seeing the house empty could suggest a happier ending, or at least somewhere in the middle where she is ready to try and be a part of Dina's life. But ultimately it is all down to speculation. And given the tone throughout the game, it would make sense if the conclusion to this journey with Ellie was a bleak one. So here we are, the end of the road, and at the end of what has been a long but thought-provoking journey, one that has taught me a lot about myself and delved into parts of the human condition that are seldom explored through mediums such as video games. And it is time to answer the question as to why I will never play this game again. Well, I think after watching this whole video that the question has already been answered. This game, while being flawed but brilliant, is an emotionally exhausting piece of art that can drain people mentally, especially if the people in question are completely invested. It allows you to draw emotional similarities to your own life when it comes to the traumatic experiences, and it almost punishes you for being invested by exposing you as the player to the harsh realities of the world this narrative is set in. It scoffs at the idea of happy endings and is not afraid to pull its characters down into the depths of their own personal hell and leave them there, shells of the people you once grew to love. To some, this game could be perceived as only existing to make the player miserable. But it is the looking beyond that and questioning why it is doing this that we see a sort of emotional education that we should take on board in our own lives. This story was bold, it was dangerous, it was risky. It was never intended to appeal to the masses, and it could have very easily destroyed everything we had grown to love from the first game. But what was achieved is something to be marvelled at, regardless of your love or hatred for the game, as this is a story of negative emotions, told in a way that has rarely been done in the entertainment industry today. And it is for this reason that I thank all who were involved. To Neil Druckmann, Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, Laura Bailey, and the many hundreds of people who were involved, from graphic designers to other motion capture artists, you have created something special, and I will be forever grateful for the journey you have taken me on with your story, a story that I hope to seldom experience again. And to you, who's watching right now, thank you for going on this journey with me, and I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the world of The Last of Us.
What are you drinking?
Coffee.
Where'd you get that?
Those people that came through last week.
Oh.
A little embarrassed as to what I had to trade to get it, but it's not bad.
I had Seth under control.
Yeah, I know.
And you need to stop harassing Jesse about my patrols.
Okay. Dina. Is she your girlfriend?
No. No, that was just one kiss. It doesn't mean anything. She just, I don't know why she did that.
But you do like her.
So stupid.
I have no idea what that girl's intentions are, but I do know that she would be lucky to have you.
You're such an asshole.
I'm not trying to.
I was supposed to die in that hospital. My life would have fucking mattered. But you took that from me.
somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
Yeah. I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
I'd like that.
Okay. I'll see you around.
Yep.